We're going to continue with the case studies. And we are, just as before, going to allow a short discussion after each case studies. But keep your thoughts and ideas of the case studies in mind because they will be relevant tomorrow as well for the bigger, more thorough discussions. So we're going to continue with Daniel.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. I want to apologize up front. First, for not having any slides, and second, the jet lag is catching up with me a little bit. And so I'm going to try to make as much sense as I can. Hopefully I'll feel better tomorrow. The first thing I wanted to say was that, so I will be presenting at Haifa University on May 7th. And what I want to do there is dig into more depth about Iraq, which is the subject of my dissertation and now book that I'm writing. And I'll touch on that in just a few moments. But there won't be as much time to talk about that today as I would like, but I will talk about it soon. The case study that I had originally focused on was Lebanon, and specifically the port explosion in Beirut in August of 2020. I presented on that a little bit in the February workshop. And at the moment, I've been reading up on this more and doing more research. I don't have a lot to add. I still think it's a good case. I'm happy to talk about more. By way of background, I mean, prior to the port explosion in 2020, Lebanon was already in the midst of an economic crisis. It was also hosting a large number of refugees from neighboring Syria. And then on top of this, in 2020, of course, COVID. And then in August of 2020, there was the explosion, one of the largest non-nuclear explosions in history as a result of a large dash of ammonium nitrate at the Beirut port catching fire. And then, as we all know, this resulted in the devastation of Beirut. It exacerbated COVID at the time. It also contributed to food shortages in Lebanon and exacerbated the political crisis. And so I think it yeah, talk about it soon.
וואו, התחיל לעשות חול רצינית. אולי צריך לקחת גם מהחוק שלה. זה לא הם משוגעים, הם יקחו אותם עכשיו בדיוק.
If there will be a flag, just it's an ordinary emergency, so we don't need to. Just ignore it.
What I spoke about in February, though, was the investigation into the explosion, which had been delayed on a number of occasions for political reasons, the legal investigation, and actually just, I believe last month, it was finally restarted again, a 2-year or so hiatus. And I think that it's sort of emblematic of the crisis that Lebanon has been in, arguable. And this is what we get back to the point about timelines or time frames. I think there's a case to be made that this crisis is sort of the culmination of the dysfunction in Lebanon since the end of the Civil War and the agreement that ended it in 1989, the Taif Agreement. And I think that this is sort of just the culmination of multiple crises intersecting, coming to a head. And so I don't know if it makes sense to see the explosion as a crisis itself or more as symptomatic of the multiple crises that Lebanon was already undergoing. So that's one case. I really did quickly, though, want to touch on another case that I was kind of kicking myself for not thinking of sooner. And this isn't fully fleshed out yet, so I apologize again that this isn't as polished as some of the other presentations that you're hearing. But this is the Ebola outbreak in West Africa back in 2014, 2015. So in a previous life, before I did my PhD, I was a researcher at a think tank in DC working on issues related to global health governance and global health security. So I did a lot of research on especially the WHO's response or non-response to the Ebola outbreak back in 2014. But it occurred to me that this might also potentially be a useful case because in the 3 countries in West Africa that were most affected by the Ebola outbreak, Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone, they had a lot in common in that 2 of them, Liberia and Sierra Leone, had fairly recently emerged from civil wars. All 3 of them were extremely poor, low economic growth, but they were also characterized by low trust in governments. And so they were very politically fragmented societies where the central government actually didn't have a strong presence in most of the 3 countries to begin with. The borders between them, they're all bordering each other, were quite porous. And that is what helped facilitate the spread of Ebola once it did break out in Guinea. There was also, like I said, a high degree of distrust of the government, and that goes back decades relating to the civil wars, ineffective governance, corruption. And so all of these factors, I mean, the political, the economic, intersected and were exacerbated by the Ebola outbreak. I was also thinking about the cultural question in this case as well, because as you might remember, as you might know, part of what contributed to the spread of Ebola in each of those 3 countries were traditional burial practices, especially related to touching of the bodies of the deceased that were infected with Ebola, and that contributed to its spread. And so one of the issues that these governments faced early in the epidemic was that they were not communicating effectively with the parts of the countries, especially outside of the cities, that were most susceptible to the outbreak. They weren't conveying the dangers of the disease in a way that was culturally sensitive, especially with regard to these burial practices. And in fact, a lot of the issue came from people not trusting foreign health workers or central government authorities who came to help protect them from the virus. And so what it did was it drove a lot of people who were sick with Ebola to hide their infections and to go underground. There was no trust in the health centers that were established. And so it made it almost impossible to monitor the outbreak as it was occurring because people didn't trust the government authorities. And there were a lot of conspiracy theories as well about this virus being made up or being used as a pretext by these governments to assert their authority, and in highly polarized political situations. What also could be interesting and relevant to this group is the fact that all 3 of these countries declared states of emergency and announced plans to establish quarantines and lockdowns in parts of the countries. And that also triggered a lot of fear among political opposition movements in all 3 of the countries that this was going to be used as a pretext to crack down on political dissent and also to delay elections. But what's interesting, though, is that this was clearly, I think, in many ways a public health failure, of course. But I also want to think about whether this could be seen as a case of political resilience in the face of these emergencies or these compounding emergencies. Because I believe in all 3 of these countries, plans for elections did go forward eventually. They were delayed, but they did go forward. There was also some violence against protesters who were defying the lockdown orders, but those ended up being fewer than people expected at the time. At the time, there was a lot of talk about the collapse of these societies, about the collapse of governments, but that didn't happen. And so I think one area for perhaps further thought is what went right. And so getting away from this notion that this was such a catastrophic failure, yes, on the global health front, but something also potentially did go right. So that's something else I was just thinking about really over the last few days, digging into some of my old research on this. And the final, and actually I should say also, excuse me, on that note, on West Africa, again, this brings up the time frame issue. I mean, these civil wars had already ended in the early thousands, late 90s, early 2000s in those countries, but they were still suffering the after effects of it. And so, again, this is a case of of weak states that had failed not only to establish public health capacities, but also legitimacy. And so, yeah, that's important. And then the last case that, again, I'll dig into more when I present later this coming week, is Iraq, specifically Iraq in the early 1990s. So that's the subject of my book that I'm writing at the moment. What I want to talk about specifically, and I'm not sure still how or whether this fits into what this group is trying to do. But basically, after Iraq invaded Kuwait in 1990, it was subjected to the most comprehensive UN sanctions regime, the most comprehensive multilateral sanctions regime the world had ever seen up until that time. Iraq was uniquely susceptible to the interruption of international trade. It relied on its oil exports to finance a great deal of its imports, including 75% of its food. And so sanctions meant that Iraq was no longer allowed to export oil and therefore no longer allowed to import food under the rules of the sanctions. And then in the US-led war to liberate Kuwait in early 1991, Iraqi infrastructure was decimated by the airstrikes. It led to the utter destruction of Iraqi electrical production capabilities, sewage treatment, water purification facilities, roads, bridges, et cetera, all the things that the country relied on to transport food and medicine. And so after the war, it became very quickly clear that Iraq was on the verge of famine, epidemics, and needed humanitarian assistance. And this was further compounded by the fact that right after the war ended, the Gulf War, uprisings broke out in the predominantly Shia south and Kurdish north of the country, which, of course, contributed to further destabilization around the country, further violence and further destruction of infrastructure. Added to this then was a US-led humanitarian intervention to help the 2 million Kurdish refugees that fled the fighting in northern Iraq. And so I can go into all of this in more detail either now or later this week if that's of interest. But what I wanted to propose and what I'm arguing in my book is that Iraq already by the early 1990s was becoming a failed state in many ways, but it was a failed state by design to some extent. And this was because the US and Western European allies were trying to do everything they could to pursue regime change against Saddam Hussein, short of long-term occupation of the country. And they did this not only through the humanitarian intervention, but also through UN weapons inspections that were highly intrusive, through the establishment of a de facto independent Kurdistan in the north, and then through what would later be called the Oil for Food program, which essentially placed Iraqi oil exports under international trust, under the management of the UN, in exchange for UN-monitored food imports. And so all of these measures, what I'm arguing, essentially were, first of all, extremely experimental. And what made them possible really was only the fact that the Cold War was ending, and then that the US no longer had to fear the backlash of the Soviet Union. But it also sent the UN into really uncharted territory. And it conditioned Iraqi sovereignty in the name of payment of Saddam Hussein and also ideally regime change as far as the US was concerned. And I think that you could see the hollowing out of the Iraqi state after 2003 when the US invaded and Iraq quickly collapsed. So the Ba'athist government was ostensibly on the surface quite still powerful, but it was just a veneer of power. Really, there was very little state structure left at that point. And so focusing though on the early 1990s, I do think that there's a case to be made that these are cascading crises related to the war and its effects, both intentional and unintentional. but I'm trying still to figure out how this fits within the framework that we've been discussing so far. So I would be really eager to hear anybody's thoughts on that. Maybe I can leave it there for now, and happy to answer questions or get feedback on any of those cases.
A quick question on
Yes.
Iraq, or maybe on all three. But so if you, when you do the analysis, I understand the point about the Ebola as a form of resilience. But if we have to ask ourselves something about the conditions, something about variables, and something about the connectedness of cascading complex, what would be the Iraqi story stand for? So I understand the US undermined capacities in Iraq, and therefore, lo and behold, Iraq collapsed. Okay. But if this is all there is to it, then we can say, all right, if through sanction regimes undermine internal capacities, then they're undermined. But the question is whether there's more to it, whether there's something to be said about Iraq truly trying to get out, emerge after Saddam Hussein. So after Hussein is gone, then what? So you can always, as Maya said before, you can always relate it back to some time before. What are the vulnerabilities that made Iraq a complex story? What post-Saddam, right?
So post-Saddam is actually, I think, a very different story than the focus, than my focus of the 90s, especially the early 90s. But the point taken, understood. I mean, I think, well, go back to the early 90s first, before I talk about post-Saddam. I mean, I think that one interesting point that came up earlier was whether the, attempts to find a solution can make things worse, right? I mean, I think that that's very clearly the case in the early 90s. I mean, the war itself that was fought to restore Kuwait, of course, liberated Iraqi infrastructure, but I think also the humanitarian intervention after the fact, plus the other measures that were taken, actually made Iraq weaker, but that was the point. It made it weaker by design. And so that's why I'm not sure.
The post the gas attack on the Kurds and all that, how does that factor in? In the name of the Kurds community that were under attack?
No, I mean, what I'm talking about, well, let me think about this a little bit more, actually. That's okay.
I'm trying to connect the dots in a way that can tell us something about vulnerabilities, but stresses to internal organs of a state that then led the state to be more susceptible to collapses, about definitions of what collapses are, the fact that makes state more difficult, stuff that makes it more difficult for the state to then come out of it and reemerge in terms of rehabilitation and resilience.
I think that the first two examples are very important for our vocabulary and terminology, because Ebola is a cascading.
Could be a cascade.
Cascade. Why it is cascading? Because you can say that under different conditions, when people trust the government and it would not have been as worse as it was.
That doesn't make it cascading.
It's not like it's called cascading.
It's cascading
It
because
makes it a more extreme disaster.
It's more durable.
yeah,
More durable.
it's cascading in the sense that it deteriorates.
So that's just more durable.
But the explosion in Beirut is more a multiple thing. Why? Because you can say that if people would have trusted the government and if the investigation committee and the lessons to be learned, then such explosion would have occurred. Or if there was once an explosion, it would not reoccur. For example, the fires. And I think that this might be an interesting story to try to develop. So the kind of emergency or extreme conditions
So just
are affected by other variables like the level of government, the trust that we have, the impartiality
just
of
to
authority.
so you say that there is a vulnerability. You're trying to identify vulnerabilities, make certain crises more likely to recur.
That's the multiple.
No,
But it's
it's
not.
not a multiple. It's a recurrence.
The variability, it's not on another emergency situation.
It's a recurrence of the
I
same.
think we have to figure out what we're talking about.
Yes.
I mean, you can have a disaster that occurs in a place that has many vulnerabilities for a number of reasons. But those reasons aren't necessarily ongoing emergencies or ongoing disasters.
And the fires will return so long as the vulnerabilities are not fixed.
Right,
You-
but that's
it
still
will
a
recur.
silo.
Yeah.
I mean, it's still a silo. It's a fire, or it's a, but if you're, and that's why the terminology here is so important. Because, I mean, I could look at what you've, very articulately described as really tough disasters, or really tough silo events.
Single
But
site.
it's not right, but it wasn't on top of other disasters.
Even the Lebanon case is somewhere in the middle between a regular emergency
Right.
and something that, so for example, I think that there was an unfolding event in the sense that due to the fact that Lebanon was experiencing economic crises and the government is dysfunction, the hospitals could not perform in a way that exceeded the casualties. So that could be a cascade, man-made cascade. But you can also reflect on this as an severe emergency or severe disaster.
That they weren't capable.
I think that what Daniel presented, the good thing that comes from the fact that you presented 3 case studies is that we can say something about gravity. We can say something about the fact that the Lebanon case is the less severe. The Ebola is kind of something that could have a potential of regional killer, something like the corona, but once again, more magnitude, more than the Lebanon one. And the Iraqi situation is more like the Yugoslavian and Sudanian sense in that we can say that it's some kind of an ongoing extreme condition. And then you try to think about what happened there in terms of emergency.
But does ongoing make it cascade? I mean, that's my question. You can have an ongoing
It's a crisis. It's an ongoing crisis.
crisis, and I don't think it makes it cascading. I mean, I don't think it differs. Sorry.
Again, I think terminology is very important here. So we have cascading, which is one leading to another. We have complex, which is, severity-wise. Complex is overlapping.
It's overlapping. It's not just severity. So you could have very severe.
Yeah, it's not just, it's overlapping.
non-complex.
So it's not severe enough to qualify. I don't think Ebola could have been, but the Lebanon one is not severe enough to qualify as truly complex.
So you're saying that severity
They said that the
is
literature
part
of the definition.
Yeah.
cascading.
And for example, one of the
How
definitions.
would you have? But you
No,
could have
severity is not cascading. It's complex.
I mean, you could have a horrible earthquake, right?
So it would be a severe single silent. silo. There could be a severe single silo.
That's what I'm saying.
But I'm saying for it to be complex.
But if the earthquake took place at the time of a war, at the time of,
so there
you
would
know,
be
a tsunami, and then it becomes
Like a scale.
cascading.
No. Cascading. Multiple. So cascade, again, we're back to terminology. Cascade is
One after the other.
something leading to the other.
So earthquake leads to tsunami.
Exactly. That's a classic cascading. Yeah.
That's cascading.
Right, but what's
Well, it's
interesting
also
in the
cascade.
cascade theories is the unexpected
Exactly.
cascade. So the emphasis, and this is like years old, like this is not really developed even in the professional literature. So the idea of like secondary and tertiary effects that themselves may turn into causes for branch out in ways that might end up kind of leading to unexpected destination. So for example, say the fires that happen, they're like a silo, right? But for some of you who noticed, like Haifa municipality canceled all events. The reason was that there weren't enough manpower or capacity to cover the security of the events. So had the Haifa University not canceled the celebration and something horrific happened and nobody was there to take care of it or prevent it, then you would have had a cascade.
Right.
Because there is some kind of connection, even if it's not straight causality, at least some connection, where one event was the effect of a second, but also the effect became a cause of other effects.
And it's interesting because one of the reasons that Haifa did that is because the Carmel fires are so embedded in the collective memories of the people. It's not historic.
But it is also a multiple thing, because, for example, if after the Carmel fire, there would have been an investigation, the investigation committee would have said, we have to buy 10
and nobody bought it.
Super tankers.
tankers or
Helicopters
or something like
Black
that.
Hawks would have
Then the recent fire would have been prevented, but it wouldn't be a real disaster.
Wait. But here we have to distinguish between
That's mitigation and
Mitigation and post-road accountability. That doesn't mean it is a
the
cascade.
regular cycle of
So this is vulnerability.
Difference between multiple cascades.
No, but if you have a vulnerability, and the vulnerability causes the emergency to become a disaster. Why? Because if you're not vulnerable, there is an emergency, but you're able to respond. If there's an emergency and you're vulnerable, the emergency can turn into a disaster. If you then do not fix the vulnerability, as you should, the vulnerability remains. There will be subsequent reoccurrences of the same. No, it's not multiple. It's the same thing. Keep going again and again. It's just
the same disaster in an interval of 2 years. It's multiple.
No, I don't.
I think it's using.
Okay,
so that kind of is covered within the regular cycle of disaster management.
Disaster.
You have mitigation, preparedness, response, the events, response, and recovery. So if you're failing on those pre-event kind of stages, then the question is what's your response and recovery? You can play on all these stages, but it's still a silo event.
Let's say that there is an economic crisis. Let's say that there is economic crisis which prevents you from doing the mitigation. Then you can say that there was this.
But if it's just poor mitigation,
It's just poor management.
Poor mitigation is a result of a different crisis, which is a crisis of the rule of law, crisis of good governance.
Maybe. Or maybe people are just stupid. It's not.
Can I just get one?
We have a discussion on the definition of cascading later.
Yali will solve our problem.
It's item number 7 in our agenda.
Okay, let's remember that. Okay.
I just wanted to say about the Ebola that I do think it can be cascading because some of the events are contingent on the others. Like when you say that there was the whole political situation and also the intervention of the WHO. I mean, okay, so there's a pandemic, but then it can go either way and it's exacerbated and it becomes a really worse semi-man-made disaster. So in that sense, I think
But that's vulnerability. What you're saying is you identify a vulnerability that makes it more severe. There's no other.
It's a different kind of disaster. It could be contained, and that would still be an extreme condition because there is a pandemic.
Right. But what you're saying is the variable that does that is the vulnerability. The
vulnerability is an extreme condition in itself.
Other crises.
If it's a failed state,
not necessarily. It could be neglect.
But the event,
I need an event. That's classic. But then you have an event, you have the vulnerability, and that's it. You don't have any
vulnerability, event, disaster, and it can continue to other disasters.
But only if it does.
What is the other disaster?
Anything, another disaster.
But that's just recurring.
But it didn't.
It's just recurring, it's not.
Okay, we have to conclude.
Because that's when we'll talk about it tomorrow.
But let's remember that that's a very
We
important.
might be here till Tuesday.
We might be here.
Wednesday.
That would be an extreme condition. If there's no capacity to, because
Is
there's a
it cascading,
vulnerability.
though?
Plane will take off because of
Because of the heat, which is not related to the weather, then you can talk about multiple.
But no, not necessarily cascading, but multiple. Not cascading. We haven't got to the cascading.
This is cascading.
Sorry.
Okay, so now we're gonna move to Brazil. Please.
Okay, hi everyone. We are going to present the case of. Sometimes I will speak in Portuguese, I'm sorry, but it's very difficult for me to speak the word in English, considering the fact that I grew up listening to that expression in Portuguese. That is the case of the cesium 137 incident that happens in Goiânia. That is the capital city of Goiás. That is one state of Brazil. It's really in the countryside. Okay, here is the dynamic of our presentation. We are going just to show that, not to take a lot of time, but first of all, we are going to present some preliminary remarks, and after we are going to present the context that leads us to this case, to the incident. It's very important to us to present the context condition because we have a very interesting conversation about what is an extreme condition, what is an emergency, and we are going to talk about that.
So, what Stephanie and I'll do it briefly because you don't have to do. But what Stephanie and I were talking about is Stephanie said that in Brazil they had few overlapping crises or extreme conditions. I want to say crises because I don't want to say extreme condition. And she said, I'm not sure if it's an extreme condition. And then we tried to work it out. And what we figured out was in Brazil, what would seem like an economic meltdown and extreme poverty to us seems like a mundane situation, not to be too indifferent about it, but
This is
it doesn't matter.
Because there's different cultural crises.
Exactly. So now that's exactly what we were talking about this morning, which surprised us because that was the point that we were going to make. So we think that it should be contingent on context and culture. And the thing was the overlapping crisis. It was a man-made radiological disaster, radioactive substance leaking and contaminating, and there was a political crisis going on, and also the economic meltdown. Now, we would say again that for Brazilians, the economic part in itself would not be an extreme condition necessarily. However, it is also intertwined with racial tensions, which Stephanie will elaborate on. And in that sense, we do think that we need to comprehend the sociological backdrop of the Brazilian case to understand why it still is an extreme condition, even though some parts may not seem like that to Brazilians. So that's the way we should understand the whole chain of events that Stephanie is actually going to describe. And we want to suggest that it should be determined on or defined on a subjective or relative basis. To the Israelis, I think we can think of something really, maybe not really, but a little similar. That right now we have the war that is like a full-on war, and we think that is an extreme condition. But just remember, a few years ago, every once in a while, every year or two, we would have some missiles from Gaza, and that was our normal, right? And to anyone who's not Israeli, that is not normal. That is an extreme condition. So I think that's a point of reference that can maybe help.
And another thing, that is the word cascading does not exist in Portuguese. Cascading in Portuguese cannot be an action, it's a substantive. So we need to put something like effect, because the translate of cascading is cascata, that means waterfall. So cascading for us, it's not an action, but we can transform into an action putting the word effect. And cascading is straight, it's linear, because it's just like one waterfall. One thing leads to another. But this case, we have it's not exactly a case of cascading situation, because it's more complex than this. We have
complex multiple versus cascading.
Yes.
Some of it is vulnerabilities and not extreme conditions.
Okay. So this is the Brazilian map, and the incident happens just in the head dot, the heart of the country. This place is really near to Brasilia. This is the actual capital. The capital of Brazil used to be Rio de Janeiro, so Brasilia and the countryside, the countryside of the country, it's a very new part of Brazil. It have a very young urbanization, but well, we have a very large country, a lot of differences. Some of them are good. We have a lot of cultural, a lot of languages, people. Anyway, it's a country with a great diversity, but also with a great inequality. So that's the point that Shani was explaining to everyone. That for me, for example, this kind of poverty that was in the very context of this case, it's not that bad. I'm not being sensible, but well, it could be so much worse. Brazilian scenario.
It's a different scale. And another thing that we need to know is Brazil, we have the Federative Republic, and we have the states, and then we have the cities. There is like regional centralism versus regionality. So
decentralization.
Localism, that's what I was looking for. Thank you. So there's a lot of local government involved. And the thing we want to emphasize is if something goes to the national level, if it goes to the national legislature or the national constitution, that means it's of the greatest importance possible, because otherwise it would not get there.
So this is the different kinds of poverty, just for you people to understand the context of the case. This is a favela that is the case do not happen in a favela, this case happened in a peripheral area. That is a very poor place, but could be so much worse, because in the favela area, we have the poverty, we have a very severe lack of infrastructure, and also the violence and the traffic. And this is a complex that is several favelas when they are very near from each other. So it's yes, the name of this favela is Complexo de Israel. So it's so much worse than a favela, because the violence is more severe. The poor structure is terrible when they have a parallel state. But in the area that happens the incident, it was just a periferia. It's a poor area, but not that poor, not that violent, not that we don't have a lot of parallel power, just like in the favela. It's a poor area, but could be so much worse in the Brazilian context. And so this is the area where the incident happened. In Portuguese, it's Césio, so sometimes I do say Césio, but the area was a scrapyard. And this happened because, okay, yes. And I'm worried about the time. But this area is exactly the place where the incident started. It's I forget the word, it's the nuclear of that. It happened because
I think we go to the.
Oh, okay. Oh, but we can.
I wanted to show that. Okay.
Okay.
I want to show the girl one.
Oh, okay. No, but
if we're saving time.
Okay. But this area, it's a poor area near to the downtown area. Could be worse because could be far from the downtown area. So the condition was a lot of poverty. But for me, as a Brazilian, I saw the area and I understand, this happened because children, very young children, was working in a scrapyard and got in contact with cesium that is a very dangerous material. And for me, it's terrible, but it could be so much worse. And here is the context because to explain the idea of it's important for us to understand that, well, this could be a cascading, but for me, it's more a complex situation because Brazil in the 70s, we are in an authoritarian government, but we are going in a very good economical moment. We are going to the economical miracle. And this seems like stupid, but it was important for us that the fact that we are in a very good moment in soccer. We won the World Cup. This changed the atmosphere of the country. People stay happier when we are in a good moment in soccer. It's an important factor. And the next decade, in the 80s, we are also in a political crisis, but in a better way than other cases because it was the end of the authoritarianism. And this case happens just in the moment of transition to the dictatorship to our democracy. So our democracy is from 1988, and this case happened in 1987. So this is important because our constitution, after that, have some points that is directly connected to what happened in Guyana.
So maybe I'll just do the next part briefly.
Okay.
So as Stephanie said, there were children working in a scrapyard and a girl, I think it was the girl, right?
Yes, it was a girl.
So she took a capsule that had some blue stuff leaking out of it, and that happened to be the Radium-137, which is a radioactive substance. And I'm not using the slides for now because we were meant to keep this shorter. And 4 people died. Hundreds of people were affected or contaminated. Houses were demolished. Things were incinerated. They had to get rid of the radiation that leaked all over the place. And this is the girl. Stephanie, you might want to explain the part.
The social commotion. Well, because for me, it's something very easy to understand because I am Brazilian. But this girl, she's not white, but she's not black. She's in the between. We have a word for that. She's parda. The male form is pardo because she could be read as a white girl, not that white, but this increased the social commotion. with her death. If she was a black girl, people in Brazil, it's terrible to say that, but people would think, oh, okay, just more.
It's not their normative stance,
Yes,
but that's the way it is there.
Just another black girl whose death. It's terrible, but oh, okay. But this girl could be rather. It's not black, so the social commotion was very, very big about that.
Okay, so because this is what we said already.
When the incident happened, the state have to terminate very, very fast way because Brazil has no tradition in nuclear stuff, and so they create just I don't know, just 2 months after the incident, foundation that has the name of the girl. That's why the girl is so important. This foundation helps people that was affected by the incident, and they call as incident, not as accident, because incident put a mark in the case. An accident, it's less severe than an incident. And after that, the foundation become a center that is a larger structure. And this is the most important point because we have in Brazil democracy, and the federal constitution is our most important document of law. And during the case at 1987, the constitution was being elaborated.
Drafted. Stage of drafting.
And this is very, very, very important because this article, it's the article that creates our health system. And our health system is, as a Brazilian, we have a very low self-esteem about everything related to us, but we are very proud of our health system, and that in Portuguese is called SUS. Of course, they have a lot of failures, but the idea is another project of country. It's a democratic country, democratic service for everyone.
It's meant to be egalitarian, and that's also part of the Constitution.
And Article 200 was enacted due to this incident.
Yes,
we're not talking about the implications on law.
It's
the promulgation of the Constitution.
It's bigger than that incident, but we have a point about radioactive substances that would not exist because Brazil, we don't talk about that. We have a lot of problems, not about radiation, and so this changes the text of the law. In the time. Oh.
Well, one more thing to say maybe is really you can see in that time the changes, the real process of democracy building, which is in place in the Constitution because it promises equality to all, including health benefits, and also it criminalizes discrimination, which is very different from the situation that they had before.
Okay, so here we see the impact on the world.
Yes.
Yeah, that's what we were looking at.
Yes, we talked about this also in the.
I think in our presentation, we're going to talk about the fact that big emergencies, right? They have a transformative impact. Transformative in the sense of transformative constitutionalism. That means that they were big enough in order to change the public conversation and then to go to all kinds of constitutional changes. That might be a good.
With regard to the practical matters, maybe I missed it, but how did the government or maybe the local government responded to the disaster?
Oh, okay. We have.
I mean, was there any, besides being the disaster, What was the response?
We have, Brazil has no tradition in nuclear incidents because, and it's important to mark that this was the greatest nuclear incident outside of a power plant. And, we don't have a lot of reserves, even the money, not the structure. So the state act in a very fast way, but in a very poor way. They made everything that was possible, but it was very, very complicated because everything was improvised. Because the state acts faster, especially the scale of the state of Goiânia. Not in the scale of the mountain, but they acted very fast because of the social commotion about that. People start to get in panic. For example, I have born in 88. I do not use anything blue in my face because I grew up with my mother saying to me, oh, the case of cesium, it's very complicated. So the state acts very fast, but in a very poor way. You can see by the picture. It was in a school I forget the word, where people make sports and they make a very poor structure to
Gymnasium.
Yes, the gymnasium to see the people.
And you can see the amount of people who were contaminated. It could have been contained earlier.
Just a short, because I think one of our our missions to want to try and see how disasters cascade, but how governments respond and what's bad, what's good and bad in response to and its relation to the rule of law and so forth. But and so in that incident, we have I think it would be fruitful to think of what was bad in the response and how we can maybe think of maybe it should have been otherwise or no.
But that's the health part. I mean, we're concerned with the law, with the rule of law, with democracy. I mean,
I mean, okay, that's of course, but all in the.
They started at the center. They did things also on the local level, but I mean.
Okay, no, yes.
So just building on that point. So yeah, exactly that. So I think there are two legal questions that can be asked here, right? And I'm not even placing this within the disaster studies field. There's the disaster law, which is a field that's operating under constitutional and rule of law. Just asks how can we translate whatever is emerging out of studying different disasters, different hazards, different crises, and how can we translate that into policies, into regulations, into something that could be kind of incorporated into the legal system. That's one part. And I feel that your story is telling that story. The other question, maybe I'm limiting this way too much, but I feel that we were kind of more geared towards looking how such disasters, especially if they're amplified within a cascading or multiple frameworks, could impact on the rule of law.
I think that's amazing to hear. And maybe that does have to do with the relative or subjective part that we were talking about, that you see the major disasters here that are multiple confess, whatever you want to call them. And from it emerges a democratic, a better democratic framework, the Constitution. It could go the other way, right? They could declare, an emergency situation and have lockdown and
that's a good point.
That's not.
So yeah. So can you just explain what do you think distinguishes the Brazilian case in that sense?
I think we have to think about it more, and we have to do more research. But intuitively, what I would say is first they were in the process of drafting the Constitution, so it could have immediate effect on that. It's not amending a Constitution, right? And it's not going into a Constitution in 20 years. It's happening now. Also, I think it has to do with the federative structure. The fact that it had such a great impact that they kind of had do something with it, well, that also goes to the fact that they were in the process of to give legitimization or legitimacy to the constitution that they're enacting. Maybe if they ignored it, maybe that would not go over well because there was a lot of like public responses to it.
I want to suggest two variables here, maybe 2 points. One relates to the conversation with Newman and Fadi. I think that we can say that. Actually, let's start with the first one. We should, I think, be very clear that Brazil has some vulnerabilities. One vulnerability is economic disparities. This is not a crisis. This is not an economic constraint. It's a vulnerability. What we can identify, the container, the analytical container for that, which is an ongoing structural societal feature of a certain culture, a certain jurisdiction, we call it a vulnerability. So Brazil has a vulnerability, which in and of itself is an ongoing vulnerability. And then there is a trigger, which is an event, which then makes this vulnerability, or this event in that vulnerability becomes an emergency, could be a cascading emergency, a multiple, or a complex. We have to study which type of vulnerability generates which type. It could be just single silo. Vulnerability can cause it to recur. Well, okay, so that's a relationship between vulnerabilities and events. That's point number one. Point number two is the notion of the rule of law. The rule of law can be a vulnerability. You can have a vulnerability that the rule of law is weak, the rule of law is not. Or, it doesn't have to be necessarily or, an effect of the crisis could be either you change the expectations from what the law should do. So you could say, well, we call it naming, blaming, right? You have to name it as a legal problem. Somebody has to think, well, the law, if you change the law, it's part of the response for the mitigation of the next one. It's part of the infrastructure that we need so that it won't happen again. You could decide, no, it's not a legal problem. It's a problem, you have to have better equality or better containment of radiological, so you have to, it's a question of perception, right? You have in your mind to say, okay, this is a legal problem. It's not a problem of capacity of this and that, it's a problem of legal capacity. And then I agree with you that it's also an interesting question, we usually call it bricolage, of what are the tools that are available to those that have to solve a problem at a certain given point. Could be that if the constitutional process was dormant, nobody would have thought, oh, now we have to start the constitutional amendment procedure to change the constitution just because Deborah passed away. But bricolage, so the contingents of that which you have in your mind, that's the idea of bricolage, made it so that it ended up being in the constitution. Maybe yes, maybe no. Maybe you will say no. That's not the case. So what I'm saying is that it will be very important on this Brazilian case to see what are the vulnerabilities and what were the ongoing or acute emergencies other than. Maybe there were none. Maybe there were just structural vulnerabilities.
I have one point that I forget to say, because of course we have economical vulnerability that but at this moment we were in a terrible moment. So it was
even though it was the miracle years, it was a terrible moment.
Before we have the miracle years, but in the 80s we have a very severe economical crisis.
Okay, so maybe the story is there is an economic vulnerability that has two dimensions. One has to do with the inequalities, and the other has to do with what led to the crisis. And then you had an economic crisis plus this crisis, and that joint structural coupling led to new expectations from law.
So I use the term economic meltdown. It wasn't a coincidence. I mean, the literature literature talks about economic meltdowns as extreme conditions. And in that sense, I think that.
But they don't happen if there's no vulnerability. A meltdown happens only if there is a vulnerability. Otherwise, there's no. But they don't come from nowhere. They come from because a vulnerability materializes into an extreme condition. But it could happen. I'm not saying usually how it goes. What I'm saying is that
it's a question. I think it's a question here, how to view the economic part, because that's what we were trying to convey in the first part, that to us, I mean, the literature would say this is an extreme condition, and to us it would seem like an extreme condition. Was it, in fact, if you want to look at the implications on the rule of law, you have to see how legislators and the people how they perceive the situation.
Realize we will have time tomorrow to talk about it. All I'm saying is that there are two different dimensions of the economy. One is great inequality. That seems to be, for me, to be a vulnerability.
That was a driving force for the protests or the commotion.
Which is a vulnerability of the system. It makes, what is a vulnerability? It makes, when things happen, the ability of the system to respond becomes very difficult. This is why we call it a vulnerability. You can live with it, but when something happens, then you cannot live with it anymore because you have a meltdown or you have an emergency or
Will we have time to say something broader about the historical case studies? About this,
tomorrow, I hope.
This chapter in our workshop. Because I think it's also important to, look at the narratives. I've got two thoughts that I'm happy to share, but I don't know if right now is the right time.
We need to cover all case studies and then.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, hi everyone. Nofar and I were working on the COVID case, and this is not here, so I'll present it. And the thing is, what I try to do, and I also spoke to Amnon during Passover just to think about it, and is that how to rethink about the COVID case in relating to what I presented last time in February. If whoever participated remembered, I presented the Ginsburg and Verstig argument regarding COVID, and it's kind of a bright picture of how the argument is that in liberal democracies, governments manage to contain the pandemic mostly and due to checks and balances that worked. And that was the argument. I was trying to think of how we can not only, you don't have to necessarily refute that argument, but think of how to think about it differently, but also how it relates to a cascading effect. And then later on we can discuss the terminology. Because because when we look at Ginsburg and Verting's picture, they say, okay, there was a pandemic, it affected rule in some issues, and but the checks and balances worked. Okay, we managed to contain. We don't have the cascading effect, and we don't have and kind of a bright picture. So what I thought of with Nofar and also with when I spoke to Amnon is that nonetheless, despite and that's where I'm going to try and focus, that despite Ginsburg's and Versting argument, despite the claim, there were yet all kinds of long-term, we can call it long COVID, we can call it complex cascading, but I do think it fits a cascading picture, that there were long-term effects coming from the COVID, which could not be contained, which were not contained, one of them was that one of the main effects is that was sprung out from the COVID was loss of trust in institutions. And also, and another one is you can see like different regimes that all kind of there's lack of trust in professional institutions, but also lack of trust in democratic institutions and democratic norms. And as we can see also nowadays, these are still long-term effects that still affect. Another to relate to the cascading terminology is also these long-term effects were more effective, had a much larger impact in vulnerable governments, which were mostly, I would say that there are a few variables. One is that governments with authoritarian tendencies or wishful to be authoritarian. Another is political polarization. I didn't write it in the abstract, but also social and economic disparities is also another vulnerability. So this is so just to show the overall, we were requested to write an outline. So I did an outline, then I added all kinds of information, and I have to, of course, eventually to look, and I have an end note to all kinds, but I haven't. I have to, of course, there's lots of more research to go into the details and into the sources. Of course, okay. So I want to show the outline, but of the argument and to sum up. Okay. Of course, so first thing is to the easy picture, I would say, regarding the COVID and the rule of law is that the rule of law was an emergency, and it led governments to prominent governments to invoke emergency powers, and of course expansion of executive authority, and some governments abused the emergency powers, or some were contained in the or in what authority were given, and we can go into the details. One thing is to try to I say maybe the outline is not so linear, but it's all kinds of thoughts of. And one thing is to also distinguish between the liberal democracies and semi-authoritarian, or of course of authoritarian regimes, but also the semi-authoritarian or regimes which are in the middle, or with tendencies. And they use these emergency powers to in an abusive way by silencing critics and opponents. China used it against Hong Kong, targeting racial and ethnic minorities, and plenty about that. Use it to enhance the executive overreach in Hungary, the parliament passed a law that had the organ to rule by decree with a non-temporal for the foreseeable future, using surveillance and privacy erosions, and that could be also in Israel, the tracking device they were used a bit. And so we have this framework of, okay, we have the COVID, we expand the executive power, okay, and some governments abuse it, and we can distinguish between different types of government that abuse power. And then we have, and then going back to Ginsburg and Versteeg paper, so they have criteria to see, to check, to examine if the emergency power was abusive or not, and so they have this rule of law guidance, if it's according to rule of law principles, whether it's a temporary, whether the expansion of powers were temporarily limited, and or non-limited, wasn't limited, like in Hungary, Russia, Poland, Nigeria. Okay, they were given government were given additional powers that were not limited from the temporal aspect. The question of judicial or legislative oversight. Israel, I think there was an Israeli parliamentary shutdown. Again, the Hungary's case, clear case of oversight failure with giving ruling by decree without parliament oversight. There was also the Czech Republic case. The government avoided the parliament oversight by they had a legal basis of dealing with such an emergency, but they used an general emergency framework to override all kinds of oversight mechanisms. Also, we can talk about Brazil, that it wasn't an issue of checks and there was an issue of checks and balances in the sense that the Bolsonaro acted against his own technocrats and his own bureaucracy. So what we can see from that is, from this part, the outright oversight failure was a bit rare in democracies, but where it occurred, it aligned in pre-existing authoritarian tendencies. Some occasions there were attempted circumventions, but were later challenges, like in Israel, also in the Czech Republic. And there are also ongoing power struggles. But where checks and balances were robust, they managed to contain the power graph, you can say. Okay, and this should be earlier because also one of the rule of law principles that you should apply non-discriminatory. Also, discriminatory employment of emergency powers is also shows how the abuse of the emergency powers, targeting political opponents, and marginalized groups. And I'm going back to this. This is virtually what's the argument of Ginsburg University, that they argue that checks and balances mostly worked, where the robust managed to contain and ensure that the power was not abused too much. So they have also, this is going back to their paper, they have they also demonstrate how it works, and I'll go through it quickly because I presented in February. Talk about how courts reviewed procedural integrity, how also courts were engaged in substantive rights review, and also even courts demanded the government to take affirmative actions. And even legislators also took a role in providing oversight and new legislation. And they have also an emphasis of subnational governments pushing back against central authorities, and the US, for example, because of federalism and separation of powers. I mean, not only President and 50 governors, courts, and also state courts and Congress, and state legislators and civil society pushed back on executive orders. And that was, and even the talk about the electoral process was another mechanism of accountability because it was a presidential election during the COVID. And so that's Ginsburg University's picture. And there also a conclusion which I do need to think further on, because they have this I didn't go much into the research also last time, but they have to figure out how it also relates to the broader theoretical part of this project, of the thing, because whether we need to distinguish between different kinds of emergencies, between security, financial crisis, natural disasters, or pandemic. And what Ginsburg University, they argued that the health emergency was a different type of a crisis, which because of the need of information and the decentralized tools allowed the checks and balances work, and to make sure that the government powers were not over abusive. However, what I want to focus and what I want to argue and see what people here say about it, that had some long-term effects that yet impair democracy. First thing think the long-term effects is split into two major parts. Democratic backslidings, where like there were changes in the regimes, like in Poland, the court packing happened at the same time, and disciplinary measures against judges. And though they changed the government since that, they still struggling with that. And so it's like a regime change due to the, not due to the COVID, but maybe abused through the COVID pandemic. But now it had a long-term effect that Poland is struggling with. Hungary completely changed the regimes, prolonged the emergency powers, weakened judicial review. Turkey have to look into that. But Israel, we can also talk about Israel, because we not only have a lack of oversight culture, but the judicial difference in judicial review, but it creates also lack of parliamentary oversight. There was also no dissent during the COVID in the Israel parliament. No inquiry post-COVID, no inquiry commission that amount of time. Okay, so I think one of the long-term effects is how it affected the democratic regimes and democratic norms and so forth, and that's something we have to look further in. Another long-term effect is public trust or loss of public trust in governmental agencies, and this is also loss of trust in professional agencies and also in democratic institutions, because the pandemic left lasting political scars, particularly among younger generations. And this also in democratic institutions, this challenges democratic legitimacy. And there's all kinds of, we can distinguish between what trust drivers and trust eroders, because where there were clear, consistent, and apolitical communication, it was trust drivers, it created trust. Lack of transparency, on the other hand, was a major driver of mistrust. Of course, fairness and equity, the fairness of the policy implementation was a trust driver. However, trust eroders, conflict of interest, politicizing new messages, and I think one of the focus, let's say, if you look at one of the major long-term effects of the pandemic is Trump. Okay, Trump, he was in power during the beginning of the pandemic. He was a major user of politicizing. His messages were all politicized. He used the pandemic as a way to politicize the whole system and to make the public lose trust in the government agencies. He refused to wear masks, encouraged the public to ignore the states. Trust in public health agencies were driven by perception and recommendation. Okay. So here in the U.S., in the U.S., negative perception of pandemic management led to reduced political trust, and especially among government supporters, it was something political polarization and inconsistent federal responses eroded public trust. Trust in the CDC and the FDA dropped sharply among Republicans. Republican Party due to the mixed messages and public interference under the Trump administration. Trust in federal government fell more steeply than in state local governments. And of course, racial disparities was contributed to this trust eroder. And just now, when I'm talking about it, I'm thinking about one of the comments Nadav raised last time about the media, the role of the media in conveying different messages, and how when we talk about cascading, how the social media contributes to it, and we can see that in the politicization of different institutional messages regarding institutions and how they function, which the media has a lot to contribute in the deteriorating of public trust. Okay, and this comes to another part of to try and configure which system is more susceptible to these long-term effects, and countries with more rule of law frameworks are more resilient, pre-existing democratic strength. Some who had more parliamentary oversight or more resilience. However, when we come to vulnerability, we talk about one of the major vulnerabilities is political polarization. That we can see in Trump, we can see also in Brazil, we can see in Israel the political polarization as a major vulnerability. Regimes with authoritarian tendencies, and that goes back to the beginning of this talk. Another major vulnerability is the social vulnerability and inequalities, which led to differential recovery opportunities across communities, and of course that also led to less loss of trust. And so, what I wanted to present and to show, despite a bright picture of Ginsburg diversity, so we could say that most democracies proved resilience due to checks and balances. However, there were some were more vulnerable due to populism, political polarization, and authoritarian tendencies. And I should add here, social disparities. What was the last? Sorry. Okay, never mind. I won't go. I won't share. But I want to just do that. So we could say there were two major variables that created vulnerability: political polarizations and authoritarian tendencies of the different regimes, and these created long-term effects: loss of trust, erosion of democratic norms, and democratic backsliding. That's it.
Questions. Okay, so would you say that COVID is a huge silo disaster, but it's a great case study because you can look at the cascading impacts in a comparative way? I mean, what's cascading seems to be the impacts, not the disaster itself, right?
I think it comes in cascading come in also in the impact, but also in the baseline vulnerability situation.
But that's not cascading. That's vulnerability.
That's not cascading, right? Those.
Okay, yeah.
Vulnerabilities enable the crisis.
Yes.
And then the crisis has a cascading impact, which itself could be a crisis.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yes.
It could turn into, and I don't know whether the case study shows where these impacts have turned into a cascading disaster. So here what we're looking at are the impacts, just because it's such a great case study for compare, if you pick out which attributes you're going to look at in each across the board, I think, which is what you started doing is great. And like from all the presentations, we're talking about vulnerabilities, we're talking about, when I think of resilience, I can think of two different spectrums. One is like uncertainty, vulnerability, and risk, which is also a spectrum. And the other would be the mitigation, adaptation, transformation, which we talk about.
That's a positive.
Right, right.
But I agree. But in terms of impact, in some cases, I think what Benny was saying, that not just an impact to public health. Let's say after COVID, we have long COVID. That's
law and how people
So
get.
it's multi-systematic.
Law, to the extent it generates then crisis in the rule of law, because you lost in the rule of law, there is this issue of faith, which is a mental attitude, trust and faith and all this, kind of like less tangible things. Number one. Number two, in Israel, for example, and Benny didn't talk about the Israeli case per se, you had a simultaneous crisis, which is COVID, and a political constitutional crisis happening at the same time, which is unrelated and totally non-linear. Political crisis would have happened irrespective of COVID, and COVID happened.
So it's multiple as opposed to cascading. Okay, it's a multiple.
That's a multiple case because they're irrespective, and then you can show what happens.
And what happens to the, a multiple and then perhaps cascading.
Benny, I saw that you already written 4,000 words. So if you want to take it towards the paper, what I would suggest is try to narrow down the operationalization in the sense that if you're interested in long-run problems with the rule of law after COVID, try to take case studies that you can tell a more case study story. So let's say, how did the corona legislation affected the separation of power principle in Israel? Or how did the surveillance, the mass citizen surveillance affected the expansion of Shabak authorities post-corona? And then you can to make the argument in a sequence saying there was corona and then democratic backsliding severe, it's somewhat not interesting. But to specify and also beware that there are theories within classical constitutional emergency theory about the normalization of the exception, and to some extent, what you presented could be perceived as part of that, and others.
And that's fine. If you
that happens a lot.
That happens a lot. But if you can say this is the theory tells us beware, beware, beware. And now you can see that the mentality of obedience and the mentality of risk, and you're afraid and you need the government to save you, which is, again, it's classic. This is human nature. This is what we have the state for. But if there are no checks and balances, then it's easier than to say, oh, don't resist, don't contest the government too much.
I think that, there is a lot of reference to Tom Green's books.
We like him, but it's too much.
But it's actually a good paper to attack.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't have any methodology.
Yeah, so Tom tries
anchor for
he tries to put
this is what he's allegedly doing.
Yes, Tom Greenwald tried to put a good spin to say, don't worry about it.
No, still there is a notion. I admire Tom, so
he has a female co-writer that you're all.
I admire Mila is much more sophisticated methodologically than Tom, but there is a one-trick pony that goes out of this paper, which is important, and that is it's not based on the case studies, but theoretically speaking, it's important. We assumed, even in the liberal perception, that a Schmittian perception of the executive, unbound, right? The unbound executive, and what he's trying to say is, listen, in a global killer and in a more broader emergencies, this is not that true. Other institutions
if you expand the historical horizon, the crazy use of Trump's executive orders that says, you know what, if you guys, under COVID did it, now I have to change it, to recalibrate it. So part of what the paper is arguing is, now let's see Mila and Tom write their paper now and say, and yet there was institutional plurality
in COVID, which is somewhat different from.
I wonder, was there really, or it's only procedural? We really show that Parliament gave a true counter position to the executive?
So this rule by Taibar Simantov that
only procedural. He says, well, there were debates. They convened, but actually changed anything? If you
this is the standard role of Parliament, or
just
already in business as usual mode, you know?
That's right, but you would expect, again, standard emergency theory. The more extreme the executive infringes on human rights, the more you know.
So the majority accommodation.
You would expect the Parliament to say, and we know that many of the COVID executive were totally irrational, especially in Israel, but also in other jurisdictions. And we're just like haphazard. In the United States, it was basically business. The business decided which is part of regulation.
Or state.
Or state level, or the business. Between state and the federal, we're all over the place and not doing what the federal government should have been doing. And so Elon Musk left because of California. And some businesses said, well, this is our own policies and this is how we deal with COVID. You don't like it, you lose your health insurance, good luck to you. You have to, you quit, you lose your health insurance, good luck to you under COVID. So, democratic theory in COVID.
If you are, so Shani, Lerner, and Asil Bali are now taking Toms and Mila forward and trying to develop a notion. They're doing 6 case studies, and they're trying to develop a participatory notion of emergency. Also, that one that strives from COVID. So it is a tendency in comparative constitutional law theory, and for that reason I defended it, but their methodology was lacking.
So you can say no. You can say
so attack him.
Take 15 minutes break, and then we're going to have Micha's presentation, and then we're going to call it a day.